Hello everyone. The French Revolution 1789 to 1799 profoundly transformed our world. It drew inspiration from the success of the American Revolution. The French people looked at what was happening in the young democracy and said, "We'll have some of that, thank you very much." France, in its quest for democracy, has embraced over the years not one, not two, but 5 republics. Clearly not everybody was on board with the republic idea, but they got there in the end. The American and the French revolutions were inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau and Montesquieu. Voltaire pushed for freedom of speech and separation of church and state. Some countries today have had reasonable separation of church and state in the past, but have decided to go back to being ruled by people who say they get their authority from some divine teachings rather than social needs. Even in the USA, the place where these ideas got their first trial runs, there are bozo politicians today who want the country's laws to be influenced by the laws of one individual religion. The French Revolution was over 200 years ago, and we are still making the same mistakes. Progress is not linear. We don't find improvements and then move on. We find improvements and then we decide to listen to people who said it was better in the past, and then we go back to square one. Round and round it goes. Where it stops, nobody knows. I'm only kidding. We have made a lot of progress in the last 200 years. But 2 steps forward, 1 step back does sum up the French Revolution. There seems to be a fundamental need in the majority of people to be told what to do. I mean, we all need laws so we can live together, but not laws to live with ourselves. Anyhow. Rousseau argued that government needs people's approval to be legitimate, inspiring calls for democracy. Montesquieu introduced the idea of dividing government power to avoid dictatorship, influencing today's governmental systems. This is not a fail-safe security measure, as we're finding out now. The old regime in France was an authoritarian one, and didn't care much for these principles, just like every authoritarian regime ever since. The king had absolute power in the old regime, but not all kings leading up to the revolution were fully qualified in the psychopathic despot department. Louis XIV was a bit of a brute, but Louis XV and Louis XVI seemed to be a bit too nice for the job, and therefore they were perceived as bad kings. Society had been built on a system where the king gave land to nobles in exchange for their military service. Peasants served these nobles, providing military support and part of their farm produce for the right to live and work on the nobles' land. It was a feudal system which had been around for donkey's years and was a bit pants. The system was divided into 3 main groups known as estates, which were rigidly separated with little chance for people to move from one to another. The first estate consisted of the Catholic Church's clergy, including everyone from monks to high-ranking bishops. Although there were only about 5% of the population, they controlled 10% of the land in France. The second estate was made up of the nobility, who had special privileges and status, setting them apart from the rest of society. The third estate included everyone else, from wealthy merchants to the poorest beggars. This group made up the vast majority of the population and did most of the work, but had the least power and influence. The first and second estate were privileged, enjoying benefits not available to the third estate. The church kept society in order by telling people that their hard times would be rewarded after death. They said kings were chosen by God to rule, so they should be rich and live in luxury as proof of their special role. They didn't exactly say that, but that's kind of what they meant. The first estate, the church, didn't pay taxes but gave smaller amounts to the government. This, along with collecting tithes, a 10% charge on peasants' produce, made the church very rich, earning them about 150 million livres every year, with the livre being the currency of the French kingdom at the time. 1726, 1 ounce of gold was worth 93 livres, and it's worth $2,000 today. Therefore, that gives you an idea of how much 150 million livres was worth. Religion was a business, and business was good. However, the wealth within the first estate was unevenly distributed. There was a clear divide in wealth between members of noble origin and those from common backgrounds. The higher clergy, often of noble lineage, controlled the bulk of the church's resources. For instance, all 139 bishops present at the dawn of the Revolution belonged to the nobility, illustrating a concentration of wealth among a select few. This inequality would prove to be a major flaw in the privileged order's claim to power later on. The church was the main provider of education, healthcare and poor relief. They also played significant political roles, had judicial powers over certain crimes, and its members frequently served in royal administrations. The population of the Second Estate was estimated to be between 350,000 to 400,000, making up about 1 to 1.5% of the French population. This group owned about 20% of the land in France, showing a significant concentration of wealth and resources. The Second Estate was exempt from many taxes that the Third Estate had to pay, contributing only a small fraction in comparison. They argued that their role in military service justified this exemption, ignoring that non-nobles also contributed to the kingdom's defence. The nobility had special rights to top jobs in the government and military, and they owned lands that led them to have monopolies over certain goods and services. This control made them richer and caused anger among the common people. There was notable inequalities within the Second Estate itself. Many nobles, especially in rural areas, lived modestly and couldn't afford basic symbols of their status. About 5,000 noble families had lifestyles similar to middle-class families from the Third Estate, showing that wealth and luxury was not universal among the nobility. The French nobility believed that being born into a noble family made them superior. However, in the 2 centuries before the French Revolution, the kings started selling noble titles and government jobs to rich common people. This meant that many new people became nobles, and about half the nobility were these new wealthy commoners. That caused disagreement and tension between the old nobles and the new ones. The privileges of the nobility, such as tax breaks and monopolistic rights, were increasingly viewed as unjust, particularly by the overburdened Third Estate. As the revolution loomed, the nobility faced a choice: adapt to the changing social order or resist and fight to maintain their status. This system of entrenched privilege and inequality set the stage for the seismic shift of the French Revolution, challenging centuries of feudal tradition and leading to the re-evaluation of social structures. The Third Estate was the broadest and most diverse social group in pre-revolutionary France, encompassing everyone outside the privileged nobility and clergy. It was divided into 3 main categories. Peasants, constituting around 80% of the Third Estate, reflected the predominantly agricultural nature of French society at the time. Artisans or skilled labourers, these individuals formed the skilled workforce in both urban and rural areas, vital for the economy's functioning. The bourgeoisie, this group included the wealthiest and most educated members of society, such as merchants, financiers and professionals, who played a key role in the economics and social life of France. Despite the growth of urban centres, France was primarily rural in the late 18th century, with most people living in small communities. The peasants, forming the bulk of the Third Estate, often struggled with small plots of land that barely sustained their families, leading to widespread poverty within the group. They had to undertake additional jobs as sharecroppers or waged labourers to make ends meet. The heavy taxation, demanding up to a third of their produce and mostly benefiting the first 2 estates, further exacerbated the hardships. In contrast, the burgeoning urbanisation saw cities like Paris grow significantly. Yet this urban growth did not translate into better living conditions for all. Artisans and urban workers, despite earning slightly more than their rural counterparts, faced their own set of circumstances. High living costs, especially for basic necessities like bread, which consumed a large portion of their income, and limited rights highlighted the seismic inequalities they faced. Poor treatment by the nobility and the bourgeoisie added to the grievance of these urban workers. The bourgeoisie, although living more comfortably, were frustrated by the increasing barriers to social mobility. Traditionally, avenues such as purchasing government offices had allowed some to climb the social ladder, but these were being closed off in the decades before the French Revolution by a nobility keen on protecting its privileges. This led to social grievances among the bourgeoisie, distinct from the economic hardships faced by the peasants and artisans, but equally potent in fueling discontent. Society was on the brink of a nervous breakdown, a prelude to revolution, with every citizen wanted change, but for different reasons depending on their position within the old regime. France and the world would never be the same again. Thank you for listening and tune in next time. Cheers. Sláinte. Salut.